Welcome back. So, the last major incident in Huckleberry Finn's adventures was the Wilkes affair. And as Huck himself admits in the narration, he had probably never been in more real danger than he was then. The stakes were high, people were angry, and Huck was working to combat real evil that was taking place. And so now, in the last group of chapters of the novel, Mark Twain descends from that serious world back into the comedic strain. And this can be really jarring for some readers. Ernest Hemingway, who is another famous American author that we'll be reading later on in the year, he thought that these last few chapters were completely pointless. He said that while Huckleberry Finn was one of the best books he had ever read, that you should still stop reading right before you get to the point where Jim gets stolen away from Huck. He says if you stop right then, it's the greatest novel ever. But then there's this weird add-on that doesn't really help to the plot of the story any. And I'll be honest, the first time I read this novel, when I was 16 years old or so, I had the same impression. It reads like one very protracted practical joke. And it seems like the novel could have done with wrapping up 6 chapters earlier. Now, I don't think that anymore, but I still think that it's a fair opinion to have if you come through the novel for the first time and think, why did I just read this, this ending? So, what's going on here? Why do we get a conclusion where Huck and Tom are trying to free Jim, who, it turns out, has been free all along? Well, one important thing that this sequence of chapters shows is how far Huck has matured throughout the story. With the return of Tom Sawyer, we get the return of the childlike naivety and irresponsibility that we saw in the opening chapters of the book. Tom hasn't matured. Life is still just a game to him, and he's still thoroughly a child of, we might say, the romantic movement, carried away by his desires to go on grand adventures and to do something bold, striking, and daring. So Tom lives out a fantasy. Instead of freeing Jim from his aunt and Uncle Phelps, which could have been easily done, or instead of revealing what he knows about Miss Watson's death, he acts out and tries to get Huck and Jim to act out as well, scenarios from his favorite romantic adventure novels. And remember how Huck views Tom. He's the expert on everything. He's the civilized, learned one of the group who Huck measures himself against whenever he thinks he's done anything really clever. So he manages to get Jim out of a bind or to get himself out of trouble, and he thinks, would Tom Sawyer have done it this way? And if so, he goes for it. Now, however, we see that Huck questions Tom a lot more frequently than he did before. Tom's convoluted plans of helping Jim to escape don't make sense to him, and he says so. Unfortunately, Huck isn't entirely freed from the sway that Tom has over him. Remember that Huck is only 12 or 13 years old at this time, and he's just as subject to peer pressure as any other boy would be. He's not going to go against the leader of his boyhood gang or his boyhood group. But if we're paying attention, we can see that there's moments now where he's starting to direct Tom in his own subtle way. He's figured out how to speak Tom's language. So Tom says that if they're going to do things by the book, Jim should languish in his prison for 37 years before he's freed. But then he admits that they don't have that much time, so they'll just have to let on or pretend that it's been 37 years, even if it only takes them a couple days or a couple of weeks. Well, Huck catches on to that idea. And then multiple times later, he convinces Tom to do things in the more sensible way, or the more easy way by telling him that they can let on that they're really doing things the hard way. So, for example, Tom wants to climb back into their upstairs window at night through the lightning rod, but he can't make the climb, so Huck tells him to just take the stairs and to let on that he took the lightning rod. But I think that the most illustrating moment of Huck's maturity and decision-making comes on the night of the actual escape. He, Tom, and Jim get onto the raft and out onto the river, but in the process, Tom has taken a bullet in the leg. And after the sort of torture that he's put poor Jim through, and that he's put his own aunt and uncle through, maybe we don't feel too bad for him of taking a bullet. Maybe we think that he kind of got what was coming to him. But Tom, true to character, wants to keep going. He shifts into pirate mode, telling them to hoist sails and man the sweeps, and all the while he's bleeding pretty badly. And then Huck finally asserts himself, and so does Jim. They won't go on any further. Tom Sawyer might still be playing make-believe, but they can see that his wound is real and that it needs medical attention. Tom's furious, but they overrule him. And if there's ever a point where we can say that Huck comes of age, it's right here. The fun and games of childhood are over, and all the foolishness wraps up pretty quickly once Huck decides we're not playing around anymore, this is serious, and we're going to behave like rational beings. Not even like adults, like just rational beings. So Tom himself tells the truth to his aunt and uncle, and it's revealed that Jim has been a free man for some time, ever since Miss Watson died, and she freed him in her will because she had felt bad about saying that she was going to sell him down the river. The Phelpses, and the other farmers also appreciate that Jim risked his freedom to help Tom when he was injured, and this earns him their esteem. Now, speaking of Jim, it's interesting to think about what his state of mind has been throughout all of this. I think that we can read his willingness to go along with Tom's plans in two ways. Maybe he really is just as naive as Huck once was, and holds Tom in just the same respect. We can see in the last chapter of the book that he hasn't let go his idea that superstitions are to be taken seriously, so he's certainly naive in those respects. But maybe he still thinks like a child, like Huck thought, because he hasn't been able to get an education. And so he looks up to Tom as this great, intelligent hero too. Or the other way we could take it is that maybe he knows that these two dumb boys are playing around when they should be acting seriously, but they have a raft, so he's just going along with what he has to in order to get a chance to escape. But Jim's rewarded for his troubles, though. Tom gives him $40, which is quite a sum of money for a freed slave to own in those days. We don't know what he does with it afterwards. Does he use it to buy the freedom of his wife and children? Would that have been enough to cover it? Mark Twain doesn't really tell us that. We do get a hint of what Huck is going to do once everything is over, though. He's planning to go out west and live a wild, exciting life out in the uncivilized territories with all of his money, because it turns out he still has it. It turns out that the dead man that they found in the house that was floating down the river all the way back in the early chapters of the novel was Pap, Huck's father. You'll remember that Jim looked at the corpse to check and see if it was still breathing, and he told Huck not to look at the corpse, and Huck didn't. Well, that's why Jim told him to look away. He knew all along that Huck's father was dead, so Huck is free now, and he has all of his money that he had at the beginning of the book. So, this is the note that the novel ends on. We read, Tom's most well now, and got his bullet around his neck on a watch guard for a watch, and has always seen what time it is, and so there ain't nothing more to write about. And I am rotten glad of it. because if I'd have knowed what a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't have tackled it and ain't to going to no more. But I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before. The end. Yours truly, Huck Finn. Now, maybe this isn't the ending that we would want for Huck. Maybe as readers, we would prefer for him to be taken care of by someone like Aunt Sally, or someone like the Widow Douglas if he goes back to St. Petersburg. Maybe we want to hear that he's grown up to be a respectable young man. But keep in mind that that's not what Huck wants. He wants his life to be full of adventures like the kind that he's been living. And he doesn't want to be part of civilization or of society. And after the glimpses of it that we've seen in the novel, maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. We've talked about how civilization accustoms people to cruelty and to indifference. We've seen the darker glimpses of human nature through the eyes of a narrator who hasn't wholeheartedly entered into that world yet. So, maybe Huck will do better off on his own, away from the influence of society. And that's one of the things that I think makes him a uniquely American hero. He's one who embodies the ideas of nonconformity laid out by Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman, who we've studied. Through this whole semester, we've been looking at how the American spirit or the American ideal can be demonstrated through literature, and how it's similar to or a departure from the traditions of European literature. Of course, that's not to say that this ideal isn't without its faults or blind spots. I think that Huck exhibits those as well, as does the novel as a whole. But it is to say that we can see a progress through these works of fiction in the way that American writers are thinking of themselves, their country, and the traditions of the past. We can see a body of work, a body of thought growing and progressing through the years, through Melville, Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau, all the way up to Mark Twain. And we'll see how this vision continues to change next semester as we go on to look at the essays, stories, and novels of the first half of the 20th century. So, I hope to see you then in the next lecture, and that will wrap up our conversation on the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Thanks for watching.